Mental illness was a common conversation during my childhood. My mother, Robin, was diagnosed with severe depression and borderline personality disorder as a teenager, and she was very forthcoming about the details of her illnesses. Even if she hadn't been so open about her mental illness, it would have become very apparent to me as I grew older. My mother had scars from past suicide attempts up and down her arms, and she took a number of antidepressants in order to function normally. Even with her medication, she was often too depressed to leave bed outside of going to work. My childhood looked very different from my friends, and many of the other kids who grew up in my neighborhood had active parents who were incredibly involved in school events. I was raised in Appleton, Wisconsin. The town was small, rural, and extremely white. Most of the students who attended school with me had two married parents, and as I got older, I found myself feeling really shameful about my home life. My father left when I was a baby, and I have a younger half-brother, Ryan. Ryan and I were raised mainly by our mother, with the occasional appearance of Ryan's biological father, Rob. Our parents also had atypical jobs for much of our childhood. Rob was a drug dealer and spent most of his life cycling in and out of jail. Rob was also an alcoholic and addicted to many of the drugs he dealt. My mother worked as a machinist in a number of local factories. She typically worked night shifts, and it became my responsibility to feed myself and my brother and to get us ready for school in the morning, make sure we did our homework. But my mom was usually home when we got home from school in the afternoons and spent time with us then. Ryan and I were and are incredibly close. We didn't really argue as kids, and we joke that I still act more like a mother than a sister. My mother worked extremely hard to provide for us. She gave us food and clothing and housing, and with only a single income, we lived mostly in apartment buildings and duplexes. But it was a dream of ours to one day own a house, and on weekends, my mom would drive us around all the nice neighborhoods in the area, and we would point out houses that we wanted to one day own. There was this big yellow one with a huge wraparound porch that was our favorite. Growing up, Ryan and I were treated as adults, and our mother was very open about her history, her illnesses, and her past relationships. I was told several times during my childhood that I was not an accidental baby, but that she had chosen to have me so that she could feel loved. Ryan was told the same thing. Our mother was either emotionally high or low, with very little in between, and so she was usually in bed or extremely excited and wanted to go to the beach or the mall or go do something really energetic. She loved watching movies and TV. She was incredibly charismatic, hardworking, and stubborn, and she was my best friend. When I was 13, she started dating someone new, and 3 months after getting to the relationship, we moved. We changed schools. We were introduced to 2 new siblings. At the time, she was divorced from Rob, and he was in jail. So we moved in with Mike and his 2 children, Michael and Lily, for 1 year. In the new school district, the majority of the students I spent my time with were dealing with mental illness. In 8th grade, I was the only person who sat at my lunch table who wasn't self-harming. It became really common for me to keep boxes of my friends' knives and razor blades in my bedroom, so they couldn't use them. I talked to them about suicide, and I told them how much I loved them, and I attempted to be there for my friends who were obviously going through some really hard emotional struggles. But I was only 14, and I was not mature enough or emotionally ready to give them any of the right kind of support. It was also incredibly emotionally tolling on me, and I stopped eating and sleeping. One of my teachers noticed how depressed and upset I was, and he pulled me aside, and I told him all about my friends and what they were going through, and he told the school counselor. And my friends stopped speaking with me because of it. I kept a couple of friends who understood, why I went to someone. But at the end of that year, I had very few friends, and I went to my mom and I asked her if I could leave, if I could move back to the old school district. And she was so scared that my arms were going to look like hers that she told me I could leave. So I moved back with my grandparents, who were pretty young, white, middle class, and lived in a small light gray house in an average neighborhood. My brother continued to live with my mother, and while I spent most weekends with my mom and brother, I was suddenly in a much more stable living environment, and I didn't have nearly as much responsibility. I made a point of speaking very little about my home life in elementary and middle school, and very few of my friends growing up knew about my mother's mental illness or about Rob dealing drugs. I never brought any friends home to see my parents, and I was incredibly careful about how I answered direct questions. I was really ashamed that my home life didn't look like theirs. I was ashamed that my mother had a mental illness. But in high school, moving into my grandparents' house, it became so much easier to maintain this front of being normal, because I could bring people to my grandparents' house. I even started calling my grandparents my parents when my mom wasn't around. By my junior year in high school, only my closest friends knew anything about my mom or about Rob. It was also around that time that my mom left Mike after dating him for 4 years. She moved out of his house, she took my brother, and she rented a small 2-bedroom apartment. This was great because she then only lived about 4 blocks from my grandparents' house, and I was able to spend way more time with my mom and my brother, and I really liked being so close to them. But towards the end of my junior year, my mother rekindled her relationship with Rob, which was pretty devastating for my brother and I. And for the duration of my senior year, and by April of that year, she was addicted to a number of drugs. She lost her job, she stopped paying rent, and Ryan moved out. He just showed up at my grandparents' one day. He walked with a grocery bag of clothes and just asked if he could move in. He refused to explain why, but it was really apparent that it was because of something that Rob had said or done to him. When I graduated high school, through spending about half a year living with my brother at my grandparents' house, I went to college at Marquette, and my freshman year I didn't have health insurance because my mother didn't have a job. And within a few months she was homeless and living on the couches of friends and out of her car with Rob. Her drug use spiked significantly after she lost medical insurance, and she no longer had access to antidepressants. So essentially she was self-medicating. When I came home from school, I made it a practice to bring her food, and I began asking my grandparents if she could move into my old room. By my sophomore year, my whole family hoped that she had hit rock bottom. She was depressed, she was homeless, and she'd been arrested for drug possession. She was released on bail, but it was possible that she would face jail time. We were all speaking with her, we were all checking in and trying to make sure that she was doing okay. She moved into my bedroom the summer before my junior year, and she started to get clean. She broke up with Rob, and she opened up to me and the rest of our family, and she told us that she had attempted suicide several times in the past months. She showed me her suicide notes. She lived with my grandparents for just over 2 months, and she seemed steady. She applied to some jobs, she was eating regularly, and we all just kind of thought that she was going to be okay. In August of that year, she got back together with Rob, and although her stuff stayed in my bedroom and she occasionally slept there, she was no longer actively living in the house. She went to court in September. She, she got probation. She came home, and she kind of fell off the map. We kept talking, and eventually she, asked me if I would come for the weekend and carve pumpkins with her. Growing up, Halloween was so much more important to my mother and our family than Christmas was, and so the idea of like her asking us to come and carve pumpkins, it made a lot of sense. So my brother and I met with her to carve pumpkins the week before Halloween, and when we pulled up to the house, she was throwing her stuff out of the car she was currently living out of onto the grass, and she was in hysterics. She was chucking things and screaming and crying, and Ryan and I ran up to her and we tried to calm her down, and she just kept talking about how Rob had pawned her wedding ring, and she was really upset about it, and she told us to just go inside, so we went inside and we started carving pumpkins. And then when she came in, she was really calm, and she just sat with us. She barely said anything. She carved her pumpkin, she put it out on the porch, and she told us we could, head out. So we went to go get in the car and go home. And before leaving, I tried to give her a hug, and she told me that she had head lice and that I couldn't give her one. So I didn't really think anything of it. I knew that she'd been kind of crashing on random people's couches, and I got in our car and we left. And a couple days later, or on Monday, so that was Sunday, and on Monday, October 17th, I got the call that my mother had attempted suicide. So I drove from college. It was the middle of midterm. It was Monday of midterms week. I drove back home. I went to the hospital and I sat with her for a full week. My mother had taken insulin. She'd injected insulin, which had caused her brain to swell and become hypoxic. They think that she took it right after we left from carving pumpkins with her. So she became hypoxic. She wasn't found until the next day, and I got a call Monday night that she'd been in the hospital. I spent a week with her. Every part of her brain was damaged except for her brainstem, which essentially means that she had physical reactions to our presence. So if you squeezed her hand, she could squeeze you back. She felt pain. But she was gone. She was never going to wake up. So we decided to take her off life support, and she passed away October 24th at 4:58 p.m. Her death was ruled a suicide. My mother was an amazing person. She was beautiful and strong, and she could have lived a flourishing and normal life if she'd had access to good care, and she hadn't been bombarded with drugs. I felt a lot of shame over my mother's mental illness and just my childhood in general. I felt shame for things that I didn't need to feel shame for. And I think as I've gotten older, and also after having lost someone so important to me, I've just realized that there's no point in me feeling shame for something that I couldn't control, or feeling shame for someone who is so amazing. My mother was not her mental illness at all. She was an incredible person with the right, the right medical treatment, could have lived a very normal and healthy life. And I wish that she could have had that, and that we could have had a relationship that lasted into old age.